Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall, arched windows of the St. Mary Mead Village Hall, casting soft golden patterns on the polished wooden floor. The room hummed with the gentle clink of china, the rustle of silk dresses, and the steady murmur of voices as villagers gathered for Mrs. Bantry's annual charity tea. It was an event of no small importance, drawing together St. Mary Mead's most respectable residents. Ladies in their Sunday best, retired colonels, with their polished shoes, and a scattering of younger folk, mostly there out of obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm. The scent of freshly baked scones, buttery and warm, mingled with the faint perfume of roses that wafted from Mrs. Bantry's elaborate floral arrangements. Seated by the large bay window, Miss Jane Marple allowed herself a small, contented sip of tea. Her delicate hands, clad in lace gloves, held the fine porcelain cup with care. Though her demeanor was that of a gentle, unassuming old lady, her pale blue eyes missed nothing. She had long learned that people revealed far more of themselves in casual conversation than they ever intended. On her right, Mrs. Hargreaves, stout, red-faced, and always eager for drama, leaned forward with barely contained excitement. "Oh, it's a dreadful thing, Miss Marple, quite dreadful. To be murdered in one's own home. Why, it hardly bears thinking about." Across the table, Colonel Weston cleared his throat, his bristly white mustache twitching as he set down his half-eaten cucumber sandwich. "We don't yet know it was murder, madam." His deep voice carried the weight of a man who had seen enough of the world to temper excitement with reason. Dr. Haydock mentioned it could have been a simple fall. Miss Marple smiled softly, the corners of her lips barely moving. "A fall, yes. Such a tragic accident." She paused, stirring her tea with an absent-minded air. "But accidents, dear Colonel, do not often involve locked doors and missing house keys." A ripple of whispers spread through the gathering. The death of Roger Forsyth had sent a tremor through the normally placid village. He had been found that morning at the foot of his staircase, his limbs sprawled at unnatural angles, his expression frozen in what some claimed was fear, or was it surprise? Mrs. Pollitt, his longtime housekeeper, had been the one to discover him when she arrived at her usual hour. The front door had been locked from the inside, the key missing, and the windows were all bolted. A tragic accident, the authorities had initially concluded. And yet, as more details emerged, speculation grew. Mr. Forsyth had been a solitary figure, his affairs private, his past largely unknown. Some claimed he had been a scholar of sorts, a man of letters who spent long hours among dusty tomes and forgotten manuscripts. Others whispered of old family disputes, lost inheritances, and, most curiously, an unexpected visitor in recent weeks. Miss Marple observed her companions with quiet amusement. The villagers, as always, were eager to weave their own versions of events. each retelling more elaborate than the last. "You know what they say," Mrs. Bantry interjected in a hushed voice, leaning closer. "A man like that, keeping to himself all these years, it stands to reason there'd be secrets." "Secrets, indeed," Mrs. Hargreaves agreed, dabbing her forehead with an embroidered handkerchief. "I heard from Mr. Phelps, who delivers the groceries, that a stranger had been seen near Forsyth's house just last week. A woman, dressed rather smartly, asking questions. That sort of thing isn't normal." Colonel Weston gave an impatient sniff. "Poppycock! The man tripped. Simple as that." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Perhaps, but if a fall, why was his expression one of such, how shall I put it? Shock." The colonel frowned. "You can't possibly believe that nonsense about his face." "Oh, I wouldn't call it nonsense," Miss Marple murmured. "You see, when people fall unexpectedly, they tend to look surprised, not horrified." She placed her spoon gently onto her saucer. "It is quite a different thing." At that moment, the door to the hall swung open. A hush fell over the room as Inspector Graves entered, his usual confident stride slightly subdued. His face was lined with concern as his gaze scanned the crowd before finally resting on Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," he said gravely, "we may need your help." Mrs. Bantry let out a delighted gasp. "Oh, my dear, I do believe you're about to solve a murder!" Miss Marple merely reached for her gloves, her expression unreadable. "I had rather thought I might be." Chapter 2. The sitting room of the Grange was a cavernous space, its grandeur dimmed by years of neglect. The heavy curtains, once a deep burgundy, had faded to a dull rust, their edges stiff with dust. The mahogany sideboard bore the weight of silver-framed photographs, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose expressions seemed to frown upon the current state of affairs. Mrs. Pollitt, the housekeeper, sat stiffly on the edge of an armchair, her fingers twisting at the lace trim of her apron. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and her reddened eyes suggested she had been crying. She had worked for Mr. Forsyth for over 20 years, and though her demeanor was that of professional restraint, it was clear that the shock of her employer's death had unsettled her deeply. Miss Marple, seated opposite her, studied the woman with quiet attentiveness. "It must have been a terrible shock, Mrs. Pollitt," she said gently. The housekeeper swallowed and nodded. I still can't believe it, ma'am. Mr. Forsyth, he was always so careful. Set in his ways he was, never rushed about or took risks." Graves, standing by the fireplace, folded his arms. "You were the one who found him, correct?" "Mrs." Pollitt nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I let myself in this morning, just as I always do. It was early, but he's an early riser. Was—" She caught herself and let out a shuddering breath. "When he didn't answer my knock, I thought it strange. The house was too quiet." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Did he not have visitors last night?" The housekeeper's brow furrowed. "Not that I know of. But then again, Mr. Forsyth never told me much about his private business." "Yet you said the house was too quiet," Miss Marple pointed out. "Was it not always quiet?" Mrs. Pollitt hesitated, as if realizing her own words. I suppose I meant a different sort of quiet. Usually, I hear him moving about in the mornings, his footsteps on the floorboards, the creak of the stairs." She shuddered. "But today, nothing." Graves took out his notebook. "You said the front door was locked when you arrived. Did Mr. Forsyth always bolt it from the inside?" "Oh, yes, sir. He was very particular about security. Always made sure every door and window was locked before retiring." Miss Marple's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of her chair. And yet, the key was missing. Mrs. Pollitt's. breath hitched. "That's what I don't understand, ma'am. I looked for it, I did. On the floor, by the door, everywhere. But it wasn't there." Graves exhaled sharply. "And there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were all secure." Mrs. Pollitt nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. I checked them myself, just to be sure. Nothing was out of place." Miss Marple, who had been watching the woman's trembling hands, asked softly, "Mrs. Pollitt, when you found Mr. Forsythe, how exactly? Was he lying?" The housekeeper's lips trembled. "He was at the bottom of the staircase, crumpled, like he'd fallen forward. His arms were stretched out a bit, and his head—" She closed her eyes briefly. "His head was turned to one side, like he'd seen something before he—" A quiet sob broke from her throat, and she covered her mouth. Miss Marple glanced at Graves, who was watching with a furrowed brow. "Forgive me," she said kindly. "But did he look surprised?" Mrs. Pollitt sniffed, composing herself. "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly it. Surprised." There was a pause. Then Graves spoke, his voice low. "Dr. Haydock's initial report said there were no defensive wounds, no sign that he had struggled. Just a broken neck from the fall." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "And yet he had the look of someone who had seen something unexpected." Mrs. Pollitt nodded, gripping the edge of her apron. "It was his eyes, ma'am. Wide open. And his mouth. Just a little open. Like he wanted to say something, but never got the chance." The room fell into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the lawn. At last, she turned back to the housekeeper. "Tell me, Mrs. Pollitt, was anything else missing from the house?" The woman blinked. "Missing?" "Yes. Anything at all. Something small, perhaps." Mrs. Pollitt hesitated. "Well, I don't think so. I haven't had the heart to look through all his things yet." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "But if you do notice something gone, I should very much like to know." Graves straightened. "We'll have a thorough search conducted." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I expect that will be quite helpful." She stood, adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan. "And one last thing, Mrs. Pollitt. Was Mr. Forsythe expecting a visitor last night?" The woman's face clouded. "Not that he told me, ma'am, but—" She hesitated. "Yes? Well," she bit her lip. "I did see something odd yesterday, just before I left for the evening." Graves leaned forward. "Go on." Mrs. Pollitt wrung her hands. "It was just after sunset. I was leaving through the back garden when I noticed a shadow at the study window." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "A shadow?" "Yes, ma'am. I thought it was Mr. Forsythe at first, but the shape, it didn't look quite right. It was taller, and it moved very quickly, like someone ducking away when they saw me looking." Graves's eyes narrowed. "Did you see their face?" Mrs. Pollitt shook her head. "No, sir. It was getting dark. But I had the oddest feeling. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like someone was watching the house." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resting lightly against the back of the chair. "That, Mrs. Pollitt, is quite interesting indeed." Another silence fell over the room. This time, it was not the silence of grief, but of something else. The faintest ripple of unease. Graves closed his notebook. "I'll have my men check the garden for footprints." Miss Marple turned toward the staircase, her gaze lingering on the polished wooden steps. Yes, she murmured, that would be wise. But her thoughts were already elsewhere. The missing key, the shadow at the study window, the look of shock on Mr. Forsyth's face, all little things, seemingly unimportant. And yet, in Miss Marple's experience, it was always the smallest details that unraveled the grandest deceptions. Chapter 3. The dim corridors of the Grange felt even colder as Inspector Graves and Miss Marple ascended the staircase to Roger Forsyth's study. The scent of aged wood, dust, and the faint tang of old ink lingered in the air. The study door was slightly ajar, and the inspector pushed it open with a firm hand. Inside, the room was much as one might expect of a man like Forsyth, filled with books, neat but lived in, with an air of quiet solitude. Towering shelves lined the walls, their contents arranged in an orderly fashion. A large desk, meticulously organized, sat in the center of the room, its leather blotter clean, the inkstand neatly capped. A high-backed chair stood behind it, pushed back just enough to suggest recent use. Miss Marple stepped inside with quiet interest, her sharp eyes scanning the space. To the untrained eye, nothing appeared amiss, yet she had long understood that disorder often hid in the smallest details. Graves exhaled heavily, glancing around. Doesn't seem like a struggle took place here. No, Miss Marple agreed, tracing a gloved finger along the edge of the desk. And yet, the shadow Mrs. Pollitt saw was at this very window. Graves strode over and peered out. From this vantage point, one could see the garden below, the back entrance to the house, and beyond that, a narrow path leading toward the village. The view was partially obscured by climbing ivy, but even so, the inspector frowned. If someone was standing outside last night, they'd have had a clear sight line to Forsyth's movements. He turned back. But what were they watching for? Miss Marple tapped a fingertip against her chin. Perhaps they weren't watching, Inspector. Perhaps they were waiting. The words settled in the room like dust disturbed by a sudden breeze. Graves turned toward the desk, running a practiced eye over its contents. He was a meticulous man, that much is clear. He flipped open a ledger book. Financial records, neatly kept too. Miss Marple drifted toward the bookshelf. It was an impressive collection. History, philosophy, poetry. But one small gap caught her attention. She touched the empty space between the volumes with the gentlest brush of her fingertips. "Inspector," she called softly, "there is something missing." Graves looked up. "A book?" "Yes." She tapped the shelf lightly. "A rather slim one, I would say. Not a heavy tome, but something of personal significance." The inspector frowned. Could Forsyth have removed it himself? Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Oh, I dare say he could have. But in a man of habit, one must consider whether removing something was deliberate, or if it was taken by another." Graves muttered under his breath and took out his notebook. "So, we have a missing book, a missing key, and a man who looked horrified before he died." He shook his head. "You're telling me this was no accident, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I wouldn't dream of telling you such a thing, Inspector," she said, turning away from the shelf. "I merely think Mr. Forsyth's death was rather untimely." The inspector sighed, shutting his notebook. "Well, if it was foul play, someone would have needed a way out. But the house was locked, the key gone, and the windows all bolted." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "Yes. A locked room mystery, you might say. But locked doors, in my experience, are not so. much obstacles as they are distractions. Before Graves could ask what she meant, a knock sounded at the study door. A young constable stepped in, looking slightly hesitant. "Sir, we found something outside. Footprints." Graves straightened. "Where?" "By the back garden, near the path leading toward the village." Miss Marple's gaze flickered. "How fresh?" The constable scratched the back of his head. "Hard to say. Not from today, but recent enough. Small, but well-defined. Not a man's boot print. Lighter, narrower." "A woman's?" Graves asked. The constable hesitated. "Could be. The ground was damp last night, but the prints weren't deep enough to be a heavy-set person." Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. "And yet, if someone left after the incident, there should be more than just footprints near the garden path. A disturbance, perhaps." Graves turned back to the constable. "Anything else?" The young officer hesitated. "Actually, sir, yes. We found this near the back gate." He produced a small item from his pocket and held it out, a button. Miss Marple stepped forward, taking it gently between her fingers. It was smooth, dark, and finely made, likely from a woman's coat. A delicate thread still clung to it, suggesting it had been pulled free rather than carefully removed. "How interesting," she murmured. Graves studied it. "Any idea whose coat this might belong to?" The constable shook his head. "Not yet, sir." Miss Marple turned the button over in her palm, her gaze distant. "Inspector, I wonder if we might visit a certain someone in the village." Graves narrowed his eyes. "And who might that be?" Miss Marple tucked the button into her purse. "With the utmost care. A lady who was seen asking questions about Mr. Forsyth last week," she said. "A stranger, according to the villagers." She smiled lightly. "I think it's time we found out who she is." Chapter 4. The afternoon light had faded by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Graves reached the village proper. St. Mary Mead was a picture of quiet charm. Quaint cottages with well-tended gardens, ivy-clad stone walls, and the ever-present murmur of small-town gossip drifting from doorstep to doorstep. As they walked down the narrow lane toward the Rose and Crown, the village's only inn, Miss Marple cast a thoughtful glance at the neat little shops lining the road. A milliner's window displayed new spring hats, a bakery gave off the warm scent of fresh bread, and a tailor's shop boasted finely stitched coats on wooden mannequins. "A stranger asking about Mr. Forsyth," Miss Marple mused. "That's quite unusual in a place like this," Graves nodded. "A woman, according to Mrs. Hargreaves, smartly dressed, and from what I gathered, she wasn't just making idle conversation. She was looking for something." Miss Marple's expression was serene. "Or someone." They reached the Rose and Crown, a sturdy brick building with a welcoming glow spilling from its windows. The sign above the door, painted with a faded rose entwined with a crown, creaked softly in the evening breeze. Graves pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the scent of ale and pipe smoke greeted them. Inside, the pub was cozy, low wooden beams, a crackling fire in the hearth, and a scattering of villagers nursing pints and discussing the day's events. At the far end of the bar, a man with a ruddy complexion and a thick gray mustache was polishing a glass. He looked up as they entered, his brow lifting. "Inspector," he said with a nod. "Miss Marple." "Good evening, Mr. Dobbs," Graves said. "We were hoping to ask you about a guest you had last week." Dobbs set the glass down and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Oh? Which one?" "A lady," Miss Marple said. "Smartly dressed, asking about Mr. Forsyth." Dobbs frowned, his mustache bristling. "Ah, yes. I remember her. Not many outsiders come here asking after folks." "What can you tell us about her?" Graves asked. The innkeeper folded his arms, thinking. "She came in 3 nights ago, booked a room for the night, said she wouldn't be staying long, didn't give her name at first, but I overheard her introduce herself to another guest, Miss Claire Howard." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. "Did she seem agitated?" Dobbs scratched his chin. "I wouldn't say agitated, no, but she had the air of someone with a purpose. Didn't engage much with the other guests. Sat near the fire, with a book most of the evening." "And did she happen to mention why she was interested in Mr. Forsyth?" The innkeeper hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She asked me if he had many visitors, if he was a recluse. Wanted to know if he was the same Roger Forsyth who used to live in London." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves. "Did she say how she knew him?" Dobbs shook his head. "No, but I had the feeling she wasn't a stranger to him." "Not entirely." Graves nodded. "And where is Miss Howard now?" The innkeeper's face darkened. "She left the next morning. Said she had business elsewhere. But between you and me, Inspector, I think she was nervous. Kept looking over her shoulder." Miss Marple's fingers lightly traced the clasp of her handbag. "Most curious," she murmured. Graves tapped his notebook. "Did she leave anything behind?" Dobbs frowned, then snapped his fingers. "As a matter of fact, yes. A coat. She left in a hurry, and when I went to clean her room, I found it draped over the chair." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Would you happen to still have it, Mr. Dobbs?" The innkeeper nodded. "Aye. It's in the back. Thought she might come back for it, but she never did." He disappeared behind the bar, returning moments later with a neatly folded coat in his arms. It was a fine garment, dark wool with a high collar, elegant yet practical. Miss Marple reached out, her gloved hand lightly brushing the fabric. Then, with a small, satisfied smile, she plucked a single button from her handbag and held it against. The coat's seam, a perfect match. Graves let out a low whistle. "So she was here, all right," Miss Marple nodded. "And if she was in the garden last night, then she must have been the one watching Mr. Forsyth's house." The room seemed to grow quieter. Graves squared his shoulders. "The question is, what was she looking for?" Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. "And, dear Inspector, what was she afraid she would find?" Chapter 6. Miss Marple awoke the next morning to a crisp, pale sky streaked with gold. The village of St. Mary Mead was stirring. Chimneys released the first wisps of smoke. Bakers rolled out fresh loaves, and milkmen clinked their bottles along garden paths. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, but beneath the surface, a quiet unease lingered. At precisely 9 o'clock, Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. He looked tired, his coat dusted with an early morning chill. She had been expecting him. "I hope you've had some rest, Inspector," she said mildly, pouring him a cup of tea before he could refuse. Graves rubbed his forehead. "Not much, I'm afraid. Reed sent the telegram last night, and we've already had a response from Scotland Yard." He took a long sip before setting the cup down with a sigh. "Claire Howard isn't an alias. She's quite real, and she has a connection to Roger Forsyth." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Go on." Graves flipped open his notebook. "Claire Howard was born in London. No criminal record. But here's the interesting part. She used to work as a secretary for a law firm." Miss Marple's fingers paused over the handle of her cup. "A law firm?" Graves nodded. "Yes, a rather well-regarded one, specializing in estate disputes and inheritance cases." He leaned forward slightly. Miss Marple, I think we may have stumbled onto something more than just a reclusive man's sudden death. If Claire Howard had reason to investigate Forsyth, it could mean something in his past was unresolved. Miss Marple set her cup down. An inheritance case, or perhaps an identity that was never quite settled. Graves exhaled. That's my thinking as well. Scotland Yard also found something else. 10 years ago, before Forsyth moved here, he was involved in a legal dispute, one that was never fully resolved. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. What sort of dispute? Graves hesitated. A missing heir. Silence settled between them, thick with meaning. Miss Marple spoke first. That is very interesting indeed. Graves nodded. According to the records, Forsyth was named as a beneficiary to a considerable fortune after the death of a distant cousin. But there was a complication. Another potential heir was rumored to exist. A child, illegitimate, but with a strong claim. The case was never settled in court. Forsyth left London shortly after, and the matter faded away. But now, Claire Howard turns up in St. Mary Mead, asking questions, only for Forsyth to end up dead days later. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. If the matter was never settled, perhaps someone believed it was time to reopen old wounds. Graves rubbed his chin. And if Claire Howard was looking for proof, that might explain why she was searching Forsyth's house. Miss Marple nodded. The missing book. Graves frowned. You think it contained something important? Miss Marple's smile was gentle. Books, Inspector, are rarely taken in the midst of a crime unless they hold meaning. Graves let out a breath. So, someone else was looking for it, too. Miss Marple's gaze was distant. Yes, and I wonder if they found it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Constable Reed stood outside, his face drawn. Sir, he said, holding out a small envelope. A telegram just arrived. You'll want to see this. Graves took it, unfolding the thin paper. His eyes scanned the words, and his expression darkened. Miss Marple waited patiently. Graves let out a slow breath and placed the telegram on the table between them. Claire Howard never made it to London, he said grimly. Miss Marple's hands remained steady, but her voice was quiet. Then, where is she now? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Chapter 7. A chill had settled over St. Mary Mead by the time Inspector Graves and Miss Marple reached the train station at Much Benham, the nearest railway hub. It was a modest affair, just 2 platforms, a ticket booth, and a small waiting room with wooden benches that had seen decades of travelers come and go. Constable Reed was already waiting for them, his uniform slightly rumpled from an early morning of inquiries. He stepped forward as they approached, a grave expression on his face. We checked the station-master's log, sir, Reed said, handing over a small notebook. Miss Howard purchased a ticket for the early train to London yesterday morning, just as Daniel Price said. But she never boarded. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. She bought a ticket but did not use it? How very curious. Graves skimmed the pages, then snapped the notebook shut. Did anyone see her after she bought the ticket? Reed hesitated. A porter says he saw a woman matching her description standing near the platform just before the train arrived. But when it pulled away, she was gone. Miss Marple's gloved fingers lightly tapped her handbag. Gone? Reed nodded. That's the strange part. No one saw her leave. She wasn't in the waiting room, and she didn't take another train. Graves frowned. Could she have been meeting someone? The how? Constable exhaled. Possibly, But if so, no one recalls seeing her with anyone. It's as if she simply vanished. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the tracks, where the early morning mist curled in tendrils along the ground. She had seen disappearances before. Not all of them were the work of sinister hands, but few were entirely innocent. A woman, alone at a railway station, she murmured. She was either waiting for someone or trying to avoid them. Graves muttered under his breath. And if she was trying to avoid someone, it means she knew she was in danger. Miss Marple nodded. Which means, Inspector, that someone else knew what she was looking for and wanted to stop her from finding it. Graves turned back to read. Check the surrounding roads. If she didn't take the train, she must have left another way. Reed nodded and hurried off. Miss Marple turned her keen gaze back to the railway platform. Do you know, Inspector, she said quietly, people often think of disappearances as sudden things. One moment someone is there, and the next they are gone. But more often than not, they are a series of small decisions, each leading further away from safety. Graves studied her. You think she made a choice not to board the train? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Or, perhaps, a choice was made for her. A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken implications. At that moment, a station worker approached, removing his cap as he addressed them. Begging your pardon, sir, but I heard you was asking about the lady from yesterday. Graves straightened. That's right. Did you see her? The man nodded. I thought it was odd at the time, but I didn't think much of it then. He scratched his head. She was standing near the edge of the platform, but then, just before the train arrived, she stepped back into the shadows near the old storage shed. I looked away for a moment, and when I glanced back, she was gone. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Graves. She was hiding, she murmured. The worker hesitated. Might be nothing, but there was a car parked not far from the station exit, dark-colored, fancy-looking. Not local, I'd say. Graves's eyes darkened. Did you see who was inside? The man shook his head. No, sir. But it left not long after the train did. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her voice calm but firm. Then I believe, Inspector, we must ask ourselves a rather pressing question. Graves exhaled, sharply. Which is? She met his gaze. Did Miss Howard get into that car willingly? The weight of the question lingered in the crisp morning air, unanswered. Chapter 8. The narrow road leading away from Much Benham Station was lined with bare trees, their branches clawing toward the pale morning sky. A damp chill clung to the air as Inspector Graves, Miss Marple, and Constable Reed followed the or dirt path where the mysterious dark-colored car had last been seen. We asked around, Reed reported, as he walked briskly beside them. No one got a good look at the driver, but a farmhand on the edge of town said he saw a car matching the description heading toward the old coach road. Graves frowned. The old coach road? That leads to nowhere but abandoned farmhouses. And a few cottages. Miss Marple adjusted her knitted shawl, her expression placid, but her eyes sharp. A most sensible place to go if one wished not to be seen, wouldn't you say? Graves muttered his agreement. Reed, I want a full check on any properties along that road. If Miss Howard was taken there, we need to find out why. The constable nodded and strode ahead. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paused thoughtfully, glancing down at the damp soil near the road's edge. The ground was soft from last night's rain, and faint tire tracks marred the surface. They curved slightly before vanishing into the distance. Miss Marple touched her chin. Inspector, do you notice anything peculiar about these tracks? Graves crouched down, inspecting the marks. They're deep. Heavy car. He traced the impression with his finger. And look here. Whoever was driving braked suddenly. See how the earth is pushed forward? Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Yes, which means they were either uncertain about where to go or startled by something. Graves stood, dusting off his hands. Either way, they were in a hurry. If they took Claire Howard, she might not have had much time to leave a clue. Miss Marple's expression was mild. Ah, but people in distress often leave traces in ways they do not realize. As if on cue, Reed came jogging back toward them. Sir, I think I've found something. He led them further along the path to a narrow bend where the undergrowth grew thick and tangled. There, caught between the thorns of a wild bramble bush, was a fragment of dark wool fabric. Graves pulled it free and turned it over in his hands. Looks like a piece of a coat. Miss Marple peered at it closely. And given the quality of the fabric, I dare say it is quite a fine one. Graves nodded grimly. Which means she was here. Miss Marple's gaze drifted beyond the trees, toward the winding path ahead. The question, dear Inspector, is whether she was struggling to escape or being forced along. A silence settled between them. Graves exhaled. We need to move quickly. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Yes, Inspector. I rather think time is of the essence. They pressed forward, the mist curling around them like ghostly fingers, as they followed the road toward whatever secrets lay ahead. Chapter 9. The old coach road twisted ahead, flanked by gnarled trees and wild hedgerows, their branches forming shadowy patterns against the thickening mist. It was an isolated stretch, seldom used except by farmhands and the occasional lost traveler. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Inspector Graves, Constable Reed, and Miss Marple walked at a steady pace, their boots crunching on the gravel path. The fragment of dark wool found caught in the brambles had confirmed one thing: Claire Howard had come this way, whether willingly or not. Graves kept a sharp eye on the road ahead. Reed, how far are we from the old farmhouses? Less than half a mile, sir, the constable answered. There's an abandoned one on the left side of the road. Belonged to the Barrow family years ago. Been empty for at least a decade. The only other place nearby is an old hunting lodge farther up. Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. An abandoned house, you say? Reed nodded. Yes, ma'am. Doors are still intact, but the windows are boarded up. Graves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. A perfect place to hide someone away. The inspector quickened his pace, and they soon reached the narrow lane leading to the derelict Barrow farmhouse. It stood in a small clearing, its roof sagging slightly, the once white paint now gray with years of neglect. A rusted gate hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Graves motioned for silence as they approached. The house was still, lifeless, yet something about its emptiness felt deliberate, as though it had only recently been abandoned. He gestured for Reed to check around the back while he and Miss Marple approached the front door. Miss Marple's keen gaze swept over the ground. The mud near the threshold was disturbed, not from old erosion, but from fresh movement. A faint impression of a footprint, light, smaller than a man's, pressed into the damp earth. Graves tried the door. It was locked. We'll have to force it, he muttered, glancing around for something to pry it open. Miss Marple, however, simply reached out and pushed lightly at the frame. There was a click, and the door creaked open an inch. Graves stared. It wasn't locked? Miss Marple smiled mildly. People in a hurry often forget the final details. Graves pushed the door fully open, revealing a dimly lit interior coated in dust and the lingering scent of mildew. The furniture was sparse, just a few broken chairs, a wooden table, and an empty hearth. But there were new disturbances, footprints in the dust, a chair that had been moved recently, a half-burned candle sitting on the table. Someone had been here. Miss Marple walked carefully to the center of the room. It appears whoever brought Miss Howard here did not intend to stay long. Graves scowled. Which means they've moved her. A sudden rustling from upstairs made them freeze. Graves reached for his revolver, motioning for Miss Marple to stay back. He climbed the creaking staircase carefully, each step a warning of his approach. The door at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar. He pushed it open swiftly, only to find an empty room, except for one thing. A crumpled piece of paper lay on the floor near the window. Graves picked it up, smoothing it out. The ink was smudged, hastily written. I shouldn't have come back. I found what I needed. He won't let me leave. If anything happens to me, look at the book. Miss Marple, now standing in the doorway, peered at the note. Oh dear, she murmured. Graves clenched his jaw. She was right. The book is the key. Miss Marple nodded. And I rather think, Inspector, that whoever has her now believes the same. Downstairs, Constable Reed burst through the door, breathless. Sir, fresh tracks leading away from the back. They're heading toward the woods. Graves tucked the note into his coat. Then we need to move, before Claire Howard disappears for good. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and followed. Without hesitation, time was running out. Chapter 10. The narrow path behind the abandoned farmhouse led into the dense woodland beyond, where the thick canopy of trees cast long, shifting shadows in the fading afternoon light. The air was damp with the scent of earth and moss, and the only sound was the distant chirping of birds settling in for the evening. Inspector Graves led the way, moving swiftly but cautiously, his revolver within easy reach. Constable Reed followed closely behind, his keen eyes scanning the ground for any further signs of recent passage. Miss Marple, though slower in pace, kept up with a quiet determination, her sharp gaze catching small details others might have. Missed! There, Graves said, pointing at a broken branch along the path. The leaves were freshly disturbed, the imprint of a boot visible in the soft mud beneath. Someone came through here recently, and in a hurry. Miss Marple tilted her head, observing the pattern. Indeed, Inspector. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that there are two sets of footprints, one heavier, one lighter. Graves crouched, studying the ground more closely. She was right. The deeper prints suggested a man of considerable weight, moving with purpose. The lighter ones, more erratic, seemed hesitant, as though the person was being pulled along rather than walking of their own volition. Miss Howard, Graves muttered. She was being forced. Reed swore under his breath. They must have heard us searching the farmhouse and fled, Miss Marple nodded. And if that's the case, they cannot be far ahead. The three of them pushed on, their path winding deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, the undergrowth thickening. The ground was uneven, roots snaking through the earth like fingers reaching for trespassers. Suddenly, a sound, muted but distinct, echoed through the stillness. A rustling ahead, then a muffled cry. Graves's eyes narrowed. That came from beyond those trees. He signaled for Reed to move quietly, and they advanced with measured steps, staying low to avoid detection. Miss Marple, ever composed, remained. A few paces behind, her eyes fixed on the clearing that was beginning to emerge beyond the dense foliage. Then they saw them. A man stood with his back to them, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark coat blending into the surroundings. He had one hand gripping Claire Howard's arm, his other clutching something small, perhaps a weapon, though from this distance it was difficult to tell. Claire struggled against his hold, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let me go," she pleaded. "You don't have to do this." The man's voice was low, urgent. "You shouldn't have come back. You don't understand what you're meddling in." Graves stepped forward, his revolver raised. "Let her go." The Reeby man whirled around, startled. His face was half in shadow, but as he turned, the light caught his features, and Graves recognized him immediately. "Duncan Ralston," the inspector growled. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Ah!" Ralston's grip on Claire tightened. "Stay back." Graves held firm. "You know you can't run, Ralston. We have enough to link you to Forsyth's death." Claire gasped. "He killed Forsyth?" Miss Marple took a small step forward, her voice calm. "Did he?" Ralston's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Forsyth, he was supposed to hand it over. The book. He knew the truth." Graves took another step forward. "And what truth is that?" Ralston's expression flickered. Desperation, anger, regret. That he wasn't the rightful heir. That his claim to the inheritance was a lie. A cold silence followed. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, then I assume that means Miss Howard here is the true heir." Claire's eyes widened. "Me?" Ralston let out a bitter laugh. Her mother had the stronger claim. Forsyth knew it, but he covered it up. And when Claire started looking into things, when she came back to this village, he realized he couldn't hide it anymore. Graves's grip on his revolver tightened. "So you killed him to keep it quiet?" Ralston shook his head vehemently. "No. I went to confront him, yes. But when I got there, he was already dead." His voice grew strained. "I thought Claire had killed him. She was asking too many questions, and then suddenly Forsyth turns up dead? I panicked. I searched for the book, but it was already missing." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "So you took Claire because you thought she had it?" Ralston's shoulders sagged. "Yes." Claire's voice trembled. "I don't have it. I never did." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "No, my dear. You don't." Graves glanced at her sharply. "Then who does?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I believe, Inspector, that it is still in Forsyth's house, hidden somewhere quite clever but not unreachable." Ralston's expression darkened. "Then you haven't found it either." Miss Marple's smile remained. "Not yet." Graves took his chance. "Then I suggest you surrender before you add another crime to your record." Ralston hesitated, but Chapter 11. The morning after Duncan Ralston's arrest, a crisp wind carried the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves through St. Mary Mead. The village, though still buzzing with whispers of the previous day's events, was beginning to settle back into its familiar rhythm. The paperboy tossed neatly folded newspapers onto doorsteps. Shopkeepers arranged their displays, and Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for the latest gossip, had already paid 3 visits to the greengrocer. But at the Grange, Roger Forsyth's house, there remained one last mystery to solve. Inspector Graves stood in the dim study, arms folded as he surveyed the room. The curtains were drawn, allowing only a sliver of morning light to slice through the dust-speckled air. Across from him, Miss Marple adjusted her lace gloves with practiced precision. "We know Forsyth hid the book," Graves said, glancing at the shelves that lined the walls. But if it wasn't found by Ralston or Claire Howard, that means it's still here. Miss Marple smiled softly. Yes, Inspector. And I believe the answer has been in front of us all along. Graves raised an eyebrow. Oh? Miss Marple stepped lightly toward the bookcase, her fingers grazing the spines of neatly arranged volumes. Roger Forsyth was a man of meticulous habits. Everything in this house speaks of order and routine. The way his books are arranged, the way his study was kept, precise, predictable. She paused, her hand resting against a particular section of the shelf. And yet, do you recall what I noticed earlier? Graves frowned, stepping closer. You said something was missing. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. A small book, not a heavy one. One that left an impression in the dust. She reached into her handbag and retrieved a small candle stub, the same one they had found on Forsyth's desk. Holding it close to the wooden frame of the bookshelf, she gently pressed against the grain. A faint but distinct smudge of wax marked the surface. Graves's eyes widened. A hidden mechanism. Miss Marple's smile was kind. A most practical one. She pressed lightly against the false panel, and with a soft click, a section of the bookcase swung outward, revealing a narrow compartment behind the shelves. Nestled within was a single, worn, leather-bound book. Graves exhaled sharply. Well, I'll be... Miss Marple carefully removed the book, turning it over in her hands before opening it to the first page. The name inscribed in delicate, fading ink read, Margaret Howard. Graves let out a low whistle. Claire's mother. Miss Marple nodded. It appears Forsyth kept more than just legal records. This may very well be the proof that confirms Claire's rightful claim. Graves took the book and flipped through its pages. Tucked inside were old letters, official documents, and correspondence. Evidence that Forsyth had been aware of the truth all along but had chosen to conceal it. Miss Marple clasped her hands together. You see, Inspector, the past always finds its way to the surface. It may take years, decades even, but secrets never stay buried forever. Graves shook his head in disbelief. If Ralston had just waited, he could have seen that Claire was never after the inheritance. She only wanted the truth. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, but greed and fear have a way of clouding judgment. A knock at the door interrupted them. Claire Howard stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. You found it, didn't you? Graves held out the book. Yes, and I think this belongs to you. Claire took it gingerly, her fingers tracing the worn cover as she opened. It, skimming through the delicate handwriting of her mother's past. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She must have fought so hard for this, she whispered. And Forsyth just kept it hidden. Miss Marple touched her arm gently. I believe, my dear, that guilt played a part in his decisions. He may not have been a good man, but I suspect that in his final years he wrestled with what he had done. Claire nodded, her grip tightening on the book. Then at least it's over now. Graves sighed. Ralston will answer for his part in all this. As for Forsyth, well, I suppose some justice was found in the end. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Justice, Inspector, is a most peculiar thing. It comes in many forms, but the truth, I find, is the most enduring. The room fell into a hush, the weight of the past finally settling. Outside, the village clock struck noon. The case was closed. the inheritance secured, and life, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, would carry on. Miss Marple, ever composed, adjusted her hat and prepared to take her leave. Another mystery solved, another puzzle neatly placed in its rightful order. And yet, she suspected, there would always be another secret waiting just around the corner. The sitting room of the Grange was a cavernous space, its grandeur dimmed by years of neglect. The heavy curtains, once a deep burgundy, had faded to a dull rust, their edges stiff with dust. The mahogany sideboard bore the weight of silver-framed photographs, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose expressions seemed to frown upon the current state of affairs. Mrs. Pollitt, the housekeeper, sat stiffly on the edge of an armchair, her fingers twisting at the lace trim of her apron. Her usually neat hair was disheveled, and her reddened eyes suggested she had been crying. She had worked for Mr. Forsyth for over 20 years, and though her demeanor was that of professional restraint, it was clear that the shock of her employer's death had unsettled her deeply. Miss Marple, seated opposite her, studied the woman with quiet attentiveness. "It must have been a terrible shock, Mrs. Pollitt," she said gently. The housekeeper swallowed and nodded. I still can't believe it, ma'am. Mr. Forsyth, he was always so careful. Set in his ways he was, never rushed about or took risks." Graves, standing by the fireplace, folded his arms. "You were the one who found him, correct?" "Mrs." Pollitt nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I let myself in this morning, just as I always do. It was early, but he's an early riser. Was—" She caught herself and let out a shuddering breath. "When he didn't answer my knock, I thought it strange. The house was too quiet." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Did he not have visitors last night?" The housekeeper's brow furrowed. "Not that I know of. But then again, Mr. Forsyth never told me much about his private business." "Yet you said the house was too quiet," Miss Marple pointed out. "Was it not always quiet?" Mrs. Pollitt hesitated, as if realizing her own words. I suppose I meant a different sort of quiet. Usually, I hear him moving about in the mornings, his footsteps on the floorboards, the creak of the stairs." She shuddered. "But today, nothing." Graves took out his notebook. "You said the front door was locked when you arrived. Did Mr. Forsyth always bolt it from the inside?" "Oh, yes, sir. He was very particular about security. Always made sure every door and window was locked before retiring." Miss Marple's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest of her chair. And yet, the key was missing. Mrs. Pollitt's breath hitched. "That's what I don't understand, ma'am. I looked for it, I did. On the floor, by the door, everywhere. But it wasn't there." Graves exhaled sharply. "And there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were all secure." Mrs. Pollitt nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. I checked them myself, just to be sure. Nothing was out of place." Miss Marple, who had been watching the woman's trembling hands, asked softly, "Mrs. Pollitt, when you found Mr. Forsyth, how exactly? Was he lying?" The housekeeper's lips trembled. "He was at the bottom of the staircase, crumpled, like he'd fallen forward. His arms were stretched out a bit, and his head—" She closed her eyes briefly. "His head was turned to one side, like he'd seen something before he—" A quiet sob broke from her throat, and she covered her mouth. Miss Marple glanced at Graves, who was watching with a furrowed brow. "Forgive me," she said kindly. "But did he look surprised?" Mrs. Pollitt sniffed, composing herself. "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly it. Surprised." There was a pause. Then Graves spoke, his voice low. Dr. Haydock's initial report said there were no defensive wounds, no sign that he had struggled. Just a broken neck from the fall. Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. And yet, he had the look of someone who had seen something unexpected. Mrs. Pollitt nodded, gripping the edge of her apron. It was his eyes, ma'am. Wide open. And his mouth. Just a little open. Like he wanted to say something, but never got the chance. The room fell into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the lawn. At last, she turned back to the housekeeper. "Tell me, Mrs. Pollitt, was anything else missing from the house?" The woman blinked. "Missing?" "Yes. Anything at all. Something small, perhaps." Mrs. Pollitt hesitated. "Well, I don't think so. I haven't had the heart to look through all his things yet." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "But if you do notice something gone, I should very much like to know." Graves straightened. "We'll have a thorough search conducted." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I expect that will be quite helpful." She stood, adjusting the cuffs of her cardigan. "And one last thing, Mrs. Pollitt. Was Mr. Forsythe expecting a visitor last night?" The woman's face clouded. "Not that he told me, ma'am, but—" She hesitated. "Yes? Well," she bit her lip. "I did see something odd yesterday, just before I left for the evening." Graves leaned forward,